So welcome everyone. I'm Karen Rosenblatt. I'm the Vice President of our AAUP chapter, and I'm going to be moderating this meeting. Thanks everyone for showing up. And we are taping this meeting, but we will turn off the tape after the presentation. So we want everyone to be able to speak freely. And Luca, yeah, thanks. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to do a kind of brief presentation on the background of collective bargaining initiatives on campus, arguments in favor of collective bargaining, and then we hope that this will just lead to some robust conversation among us. And then we'll share some ideas about possible mobilization plans if people are feeling that we should move forward with collective bargaining campaign. All right, we still have some people dribbling in to the Zoom room. For those of you who just joined us, this is our agenda for today, and I just want to let you know that we are taping this part of this meeting, and we will turn off the recording when we get to the Q&A part of this session. So Luca, if you could move the PowerPoint. So as I'm sure many of you know, the existing law in Maryland bans collective bargaining for many state employees, including faculty in the University of System Maryland. And what we want to discuss today are several options that are being presented and will likely be presented in this legislative session. We're not sure at this point what shape the legislation will take. There is the possibility that there could be a bill that would grant all Maryland state employees collective bargaining rights. A second option would just cover USM employees. And a third option would grant the faculty and graduate students in the USM collective bargaining rights. And when we reference faculty here, we are trying to take as broad a definition of faculty as possible. So that would include full and part-time employees and those who are engaged in research, instruction, and advising. And we have more specific language, but that would of course include librarians, extension faculty, research faculty, really anyone who has a faculty appointment. Okay, so why do faculty not have collective bargaining? This dates back to the founding of the National Labor Relations Board, which set up the system of collective bargaining. And at that point, all state employees everywhere were banned from bargaining collectively. And that's basically the law that has stood. So in 2001, the staff on our campus and in the USM won collective bargaining rights. And basically, this was the result of a long struggle beginning in the late 1960s. AFSCME had been active on our campus, and finally, after a lot of organizing, was successful in 2001 in bringing in successfully winning collective bargaining rights. One thing, some people are surprised that AFSCME was on our campus and active on our campus before collective bargaining was established. But this is, I think, an important point because you don't need legislation to form a union or to belong to a union, right? We could declare ourselves to be a union at this particular moment. So the legislation that we are discussing is regarding collective bargaining. And basically, it would compel if we were able to bargain collectively, it would compel the university and the universities in the system to bargain with representative agents. So there's a long history to efforts to win collective bargaining for graduate student employees and PTK. The graduate students have been presenting bills since 2001. They've done so in 9 sessions, including every session since 2017. And PTK faculty have also been involved in lobbying for and presenting legislation to further collective bargaining. Next slide. In 2010, there was a nearly successful effort to pass legislation. It was supported by the faculty, student, and staff councils of the University System of Maryland. But in sort of a set of backroom deals at the last minute, the university was very opposed to the collective bargaining legislation, and the university system was. And there was a kind of backroom deal where instead of getting collective bargaining, what was put in place was something that's called meet and confer process. And that's been in place for adjunct faculty or PTK faculty and graduate assistants since 2010. But I think everyone, graduate students and adjunct faculty, are very clear about the limitations of this meet and confer process. It's non-binding, and because it's non-binding, it's been quite ineffective. Next slide. So there's a series of events that make this perhaps a propitious time to move forward with collective bargaining legislation. In the last legislative session in 2021, the community colleges in Maryland, and actually all the employees within the community colleges, won collective bargaining rights. A special session overrode a veto by Governor Hogan in order to accomplish that. So that was a big win. We have new leadership in the Maryland legislature. The longtime Senate leaders have been replaced. There's a new generation of leaders in the legislature. If Wes Moore wins the elections, it is likely, or we suspect, that he would also support the collective bargaining legislation. We are having the University System of Maryland staff, faculty, and student councils again consider the issue of collective bargaining to reaffirm their commitment to it. And, of course, there's a national context as well, where higher education is really becoming one of the fastest growing sectors of the labor movement. And just today or yesterday, I believe, 98% of the graduate students at the University of California Berkeley have voted to go on strike. Next slide. Finally, we have a new AFL-CIO resolution. I'm not going to read this. We're going to make this PowerPoint available to you, but basically, can you give me the last slide in that AFL-CIO resolution? Next, yeah, keep going. So basically, this happened 2 weeks ago in the AFL-CIO convention here in the state of Maryland. They issued a resolution. Maryland State and DC AFL-CIO states its commitment to establishing protections and rights for all higher education workers, to form unions and exercise workplace democracy, and commits to organize all higher education workers into unions within the AFL-CIO. So this has become a priority for our AFL-CIO. We can skip this slide. We'll come back to it, Luca. And I'm going to hand it over to Luca, who's going to talk through some of the benefits of collective bargaining.
All right. Thanks, Karin. Can you hear me okay? Can everybody hear me? So in the interest of being brief and so that we have enough time for discussion, I'll go quickly through a few slides, which, as Karin said, we'll make available also to everyone after the meeting. Basically, slides that deal with benefits of collective bargaining and some wider context within which we're discussing this here at UMD, just so that we are we share some kind of frame of reference in our conversation. So I'll skip the summary. I guess it's worth beginning by saying that AAUP, or the support for collective bargaining, has been a longstanding policy of AAUP, which AAUP defines collective bargaining as an effective instrument for protecting academic freedom, protecting institutions of faculty governance, economic well-being of faculty, and so on. And so in that sense, we're in line with a statement AAUP's own statements going back at least until to the 1970s. The obvious benefits are of course tied to the question of wages and salaries, where there's now quite a bit of research showing that unionized or employees or workers who have the capacity to collectively bargain tend to receive higher wages when you compare them to non-unionized. I have a stat here from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The same is the case when you look at incomes, compensation over in a kind of cumulative way over lifetime earnings of faculty or university employees. There's a recent study, for instance, that showed that men in unions make $1.3 million more over the course of their working life than non-unionized men, and received some popular press. And in our context, and for the kind of collective bargaining bill that we are sort of would be pushing for, it's worth, of course, also to, I think, especially to consider how collective bargaining as a right and as a process might benefit graduate students, graduate assistants, and faculty that works in precarious forms of employment. And for those groups, typically collective bargaining can mean even a difference between a livable and a non-livable wage. I here on this slide reproduce a graph that our graduate students have used in a packet during their sort of attempt last year to win the collective bargaining right for them, which shows, I think, quite starkly and dramatically the difference or the disparity in compensation or graduate assistant stipend when they're adjusted for cost of living between unionized and non-unionized graduate students, or graduate students on unionized and non-unionized campuses. And even though these numbers are not fully up to date, the disparity that the graph illustrates, I think, is very much still with us. Now, I think when we think about collective bargaining in relationship to wages, it's important to set it in a couple of different contexts. One, of course, is what are our salaries or wages in relationship to inflation? And on that, if one looks at, for instance, the period between the financial year 2010 and 2022, you can see that with the COLA and merit increases, inflation-adjusted wages across the University System of Maryland have actually decreased. That's the real wages by 4%. And this does not include the most recent raises and COLA and merit increases, partly because we don't know exactly what will happen to inflation in the coming months or in the coming year. But I think it's quite likely that even with these exceptionally sort of high for recent years increases, we will still be below, will still be sort of in deficit in sort of real term wages. And of course, it's also quite likely that we'll be entering a recessionary period in the coming months and years, and that we'll see, just as we did a couple of years after the 2008 financial crash, we'll see another sort of period of austerity. And if that kind of environment does indeed emerge, which is highly likely in the US and also elsewhere, then collective bargaining might be even more significant, because it seems to me that collective bargaining would be one of the main instruments to sort of fight off the kind of austerity decisions or austerity policies from our leadership. The other context, aside from inflation, that one can put our wages on UMD campus in is the context, of course, that adjusts for cost of living expenses among peer institutions. And here, the peer institutions listed are the peer institutions identified by the University System of Maryland itself. And if one does a kind of cost of living adjusted comparison with all the other peer institutions, one sees that UMD basically comes in second to last in terms of cost of living adjusted wages, behind only University of Washington, Seattle. And the differences, we calculated associate professor salaries as an example between us and certain other campuses are quite striking, as you can see here, in relationship to Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Ohio State, and so on. The other thing, the other dimension of this question of collective bargaining and wages is, of course, that collective bargaining offers a certain kind of process for addressing not only wage disparities between different groups of employees on campus, as well as, but also basically inequalities within particular groups or inequalities that traverse different kinds of groups. So as an example, we've done some calculations based on AAUP's data of the so-called gender pay gap, or as AAUP calls it, the full-time faculty salary equity ratio, which measures the inequality in salaries and compensation between men and women. And here, UMD College Park, again, in context with its peers, comes in second to last and occupies actually the very last place when it comes to the category of the assistant professor, for instance. So that's salaries. The other thing that I think it's necessary to think about when one talks about collective bargaining is what's happening with tenure, obviously, in this country. And, you know, it's clear, it's not going to be news to anyone that we've seen basically two forms of attack on tenure over the recent years, what's something you can call direct attacks, which seek to abolish tenure, you know, in states like such as Georgia, South Carolina, Iowa, Texas, Florida, and so on. But also, in some sense, no less vicious, and in a way, not really indirect, but let's call them indirect attacks on tenure, which take the form of you know, dismantling tenure by denying protection to an ever-increasing part of faculty on campuses. And it's clear the UMD practices option 2. If you look at the numbers since 2014, tenure track faculty is down 6.9%, while contingent forms of faculty are up 19.3%, and graduate teaching assistants are up 11%. And I think collective bargaining might be one way to sort of resist those trends, or sort of to fight, basically to expand tenure protections to a larger group of employees and people who work on campus. There is also an argument that's increasingly emerging in research, which is that collective bargaining actually benefits the operation or the functioning of the university as a whole, unlike the administrative bloat, which is characteristic of the kind of contemporary corporatized universities in which we work. Actually, recent research shows that collective bargaining or faculty unions or graduate student unions contribute to the efficiency of the school, which and also effectiveness of the school, as, for instance, measured by the number of degrees or completions that are awarded per 100 students. So the argument that in some sense collective bargaining would be cumbersome, or that it would block or slow down the functioning of the university, which is something that university leadership often resorts to, does not hold. Now, the kind of context in which we're discussing, of course, is the context in which is the context of a UMD administration whose priorities don't necessarily reflect ours. As you'll probably remember, UMD AAUP, our chapter, commissioned financial analysis of UMD's finances last semester, which we also presented public, and you can access that on our website. And that analysis revealed some, I think, important aspects or some important information, which precisely demonstrates, I think, that UMD administration, UMD leadership does not necessarily share the priorities that would be the priorities of faculty or graduate students. So, for instance, UMD has been steadily replacing tenure track faculties, I already mentioned, with precarious and contingent forms of faculty employment and graduate teaching assistantships. Faculty and graduate assistants are asked basically to do more work in exchange for less compensation, because hiring is not keeping up at all with the enrollment numbers on campus. At the same time, as the financial analysis revealed, compensation for administrators has skyrocketed in a kind of quite remarkably disproportionate way, which means that the top earners are earning more while the rest basically barely keeps up with inflation. And administration or management or university leadership has also increased its own ranks at quite astonishing rates at the expense of other employee groups, which is the source of a kind of administrative bloat, I think, that characterizes life at UMD. In addition, you can add here UMD administration basically is losing large amounts of money in the UMD athletics program, the loss that's being compensated for as the financial analysis, again, revealed by student fees and institutional subsidies, and the athletics expenses, as well as salaries in coaches and athletic administrators are outpacing instruction and research expenditures, as well as faculty salaries. So we have a kind of institutional environment in which I think precisely the absence of collective bargaining allows the UMD leadership, U administration to basically guide the university, guide the campus, guide the institution in a direction that's quite opposed to what would be the interest of faculty and graduate students. The other reason I think why collective bargaining is necessary, or why we should think of it as necessary, is that the existing model of shared governance does not work. The University Senate, as anyone I think who has some experience with it knows, has at present a very kind of limited scope of what it's able to do in terms of actually intervening or having an influence in how the place is run. Just as an example, the Senate's Special Committee on University Finance, which was established in 2019 and charged with advising the administration on institutional priorities and with educating the Senate and the campus community on the university's budget and the budget process, this committee has been discontinued already and sidelined. So we have faculty and students effectively do not have a mechanism to meaningfully engage in financial and budgetary decision-making on campus.
Can I just add something really quickly to that?
Yes, please do.
It's like it's not completely gone yet. It's actually undergoing review, and they'll have to decide. But it might completely disappear. Certainly, it has not been consulted with by the various presidents in the ways it was originally envisioned.
All right, thanks, Holly, for that. So aside from the model of shared governance not allowing for faculty and student participation in financial and budgetary decisions, it also doesn't really allow ultimately in participating in decisions that affect our working conditions and our safety on campus. And one can simply take as an example, the U administrator's sort of abrupt announcement just before the start of fall 22 semester, so this semester, that mask protections would not be required in classrooms, which was taken without any kind of meaningful consultation with instructors and without providing clear applicable remedies or alternatives. And I think we could find other examples where working conditions are simply not a matter in which we could collectively intervene or decide over, but are rather decided for us. Collective bargaining, it's the position both of the AAUP as well as what you can find sort of in research literature on this subject, again, in opposition to what the university administration would claim, collective bargaining actually helps and buttresses and helps expand forms of shared governance, forms of joint decision-making on campuses. So we don't at all see it as contrary to the existing model of shared governance, but as contrary to other models of shared governance, but as something that can complement and actually support, buttress them, make them stronger than they are. And finally, I guess I'll list, and then I'll let Karen come back in and talk more about this. I think the actions that UMD AAUP chapter is engaging in sort of around this question of collective bargaining. One is what we're doing basically with this meeting is presenting the topic and asking the membership to endorse our pursuit of collective bargaining for faculty and graduate students on College Park campus. We're doing that in the context of a larger bill that would be passed, or that we hope will be passed within the state of Maryland Assembly, which would allow collective bargaining for faculty and grad students, not just in College Park, but across USM campuses, or even across all state employees. And then sort of long-term pursuits that we've been engaged in, which is working on a national labor organization questions with organizations such as AFT, AFSCME, SEIU, and so on, and working with campus groups on labor issues, such as collective bargaining, but also other protections. So I think I'll stop with that. Karen, if you want to jump back in.
Yeah, do you want to
specifically
go
about the
back
vote.
up to the slide that
Yeah.
was at the end of my presentation? So basically, you all are going to receive, and I think it will go out at 5 o'clock today, an email that is going to ask you to vote, to weigh in, yes, no, or abstain on an initiative. And basically what is on this slide is what you will receive in your email. And we are seeking authorization from our membership to pursue legislation that would grant collective bargaining rights to faculty members. And faculty here refers to all full and part-time professional track and tenure track faculty, adjunct faculty, those who are not within the PTK category, extension faculty, postdoctoral fellows, and librarians. So the intent here is really to be as inclusive as possible in the definition of faculty. The legislation, as I mentioned previously, may encompass graduate assistants. The graduate assistants have held a separate meeting and voted to endorse the initiative. It could also potentially include undergraduate student workers, but we are, asking you about faculty specifically in this question. So this is going to be a secret ballot. It's using something called Election Buddy Platform, which is a secure platform. And with that, I think our presentation is over and we can open the floor to questions and comments.